then start writing the prose and then realize that this is actually short fiction, you know? So I think as writers, we must also allow ourselves to be fluid, you know, in respecting the story, you know, more than our agenda. So don't push your writer agenda or the reader's agenda. Push the story and let the story become what it's meant to be. So speaking on the miseducation of gratitude, which is why I'm here, and I'd like to thank you all. Thank you, Auntie Lola. Thank you, Kaduna State. It's my first time in Nigeria, and it's a good thing that I'm in the north. So thank you all for being so welcoming and receiving me very well. I've been so thrilled and enjoying myself, and I'm nervous right now. That's why I'm rambling. So cut me, because when I'm nervous, I ramble. So speaking on that, so Basit had said to me, "Oh, I want you to write an essay." I'm like, "I've never written an essay." It's like, "Well, you're gonna have to write it." And I'm like, "Okay, okay, I'll do it," because I'm fluid, right? I allow myself to do that. So I was like, "Okay, I'll do it." And then I didn't know how to write it. And then 3 months later, he checks up on me and he's like, "How far are we?" And I'm like, "We're far," you know, but we were not far. And then, so what I do is I always listen to Lauryn Hill's The Miseducation, right? And it's always an album I go back to because I was young when I made that album, and it informed who I became as a young adult, and it shaped a lot of my worldviews growing up from 16, from who I was prior that album to who I am now. You know, a lot is informed by it. So I was listening to the album, and then I thought, I've never written an essay. I can't write a clean essay. So how about, I know I want to track that from 16 to 25 before I gave birth to my son, who I was. So how it came about? And it borrowed a lot from poetry, because and that's why it's very poetic. Because when I started writing it, let me just wrap up. When I started writing it, at that time, I was a poet. I was Gratitude Fisher, who is the poet, you know, and not Sibongile Fisher, who is the multidisciplinary, cross-genre writers. So that's why it's the miseducation of gratitude, you know, because it's how have my world been and my experiences as a young black woman living in a country where every 2 minutes a woman is raped, every 4 hours a woman is intentionally killed because she's a woman. So how do I explain and borrow from you a personal landscape on that? So yeah, I hope I made sense.
Yeah. Francis.
Okay. I'm not sure what the question was.
Okay, so the question is, why is there this pressure on non-fiction writers to write real life stories, but are sort of like compelled to make it read like good fiction? Why don't you just write a good essay? Why does it have to be a good essay that reads like good fiction?
Can she speak about the Valley of Memories? Because I think it speaks so much to that question.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. And thank you too, Auntie Lola, for this platform. This is my first time as a guest. Oh yeah, I was a guest before, but for something else. But yeah, this is a whole different platform, and it's really exciting. So first, we have different types of nonfiction. So maybe if you're writing, maybe if we're talking about journalism, reports, and there are essays that should actually be written as they are. You don't have to flower the language. It complicates the message. I mean, the projects we write in schools, our thesis, they are all non-fiction. So sometimes if you're doing academic writing, there are things you put in and your supervisor will say, no, you're not doing literary writing. You have to tell us things as they are. Now, what you're talking about, when you say why it has to read like fiction, I think that comes when we're talking about personal essays. Personal essays are sometimes, they're not always accurate. If we're writing from our childhood, our memories are not to be trusted. There are events we may actually forget, that we may actually fictionalize a little bit. So sometimes our present affects our reportage. Now, about writing about times, I sometimes say that writers are not psychologists. We're just writers. We should be allowed to tell stories only. We shouldn't be under the pressure of talking about corruption, talking about a murder there, and all of that. We should just be left to write what we believe in and what we think, which is why I have a problem with the tag trauma writing. It is not our place to tell people what to write. You should write happy things. What if that trauma is the reality? Look at Hawa when she was talking about this Hawa Liman. It was her personal tragedy. She owned it. Many of us read the news, but we may not have owned it as much as she did. And now if she came up with a Boko Haram story, we say, oh, cliche, we've read this before. No, that's her reality. She may have happy memories from her home, but she chose this tragedy as hers. So when I see this tag, trauma writing, poverty porn, I don't really talk about it because I don't know that person's reality. You may have a different reality as a happy person. This person may have maybe something related to yours, but this person chose this dark side to talk about it. And I think we should let people express themselves, express whatever theme they deem fit to write. And then about the Boko Haram story, I don't think you should be under pressure to write from the boy's perspective. Your submission is very correct. Yeah, I like that. But I think you should write whatever you want to write. Yeah, we'll read. We're ready.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say something to that. The pressure to write about certain things in the community reminds me of something. As a woman, a hijab-wearing Muslim northern Nigerian woman, when I talk about the stereotypes and oppressions and marginalizations I've had to go through, like in other parts of the country, they're like, oh, I'm sorry, but you're a writer, right? Why don't you write about the northern experience and the culture and how things really are down the north so we can know how things are and we can educate ourselves? Now, I don't know if people say that, if when they say that they mean well or not, but I don't think they realize how ridiculously disrespectful that is. Because it's like saying, in addition to my stereotyping you, oppressing you, marginalizing you, I also want you to dedicate your writing career, this thing you love so much, into correcting my miseducation, even though A, I am not behind that miseducation, and B, I am in fact the victim of that miseducation. Yeah. What if I just want to write about love, about how much I love my sister, about how much I think my father is the best man in the world? What if I want to write about food? Why do you want to hijack what I want to write about, right?
So can I just add on that? It's very important because I have kind of like a devil's advocate kind of like a existential crisis when it comes to that, because I believe that it is every artist's responsibility, and I think I'm borrowing from Nina Simone, correct me if I'm wrong, to reflect the times that they live in, and I believe it is a responsibility as a writer to do that. And at the same time, I do agree and say that no one should take away your agency as a writer to tell you what they want to read. But I don't want us to neglect the poverty and the violence that is poverty and its existence, and all of the other ripple effects of capitalism that is not designed for Africa, to then neglect that and say, oh, I'm not going to write about that. I'm going to write about love, meanwhile your neighbor is dying. Meanwhile, so I think it's always negotiating and finding a way to how do we, the writer's prerogative, how do we use our observer eye that we have as writers and our human eye that we're existing and living and bring those together. So how do I take a love story, like in your story, how do I take a love story? And it's still fused with these world events, and I'm still sharing these themes, but still humanizing the dehumanized. So, yeah.
Let's see something. Okay. I mean, I was going to say something else, but because you raised this, I mean, we had this conversation at breakfast this morning. So here is what I think, though. Do you also think that fiction writers are under the same obligation too? Because, I mean, it seems as though non-fiction writers have this oath that when you start to write it, you are compelled to reflect the time. So I'm thinking, do fiction writers feel this same pressure? Because, I mean, Frances mentioned trauma writing and poverty porn, but basically, lately, the shift is on non-fiction writers, people come and say, you are trafficking trauma. And all. So, but we don't get to hear much of these with novels that, I mean, I feel like Uwem Akpan's Say You Are One of Them is one of the most terrible books I ever read in my life, because it was like what they called poverty merchant. But then nobody sort of like pointed it out. But then when you write essays, people tell you you write too much of trauma, you get too. Why is this like a thing for non-fiction writers? Why is there this pressure to always it seems as though they always want to give you like a sketch of things you have to talk about. I mean, because if we look at what recently happened in South Africa, in your case, I saw, because the mail we had when you mentioned that how we should talk about, like, I don't think, I mean, it is possible that novels in recent time talk about these things, but then as a non-fiction writer, even if nobody tells you, somehow in your head you think, I have to write about this because we are obligated to do it, you get?
I think we're all human beings existing in this world. And sometimes writers have this warped sense of they exist in a different world outside of the world that you exist in. I'm currently here right now, and there is Afrophobia in the world. So yes, world events affect me. So there's no way I can deliberately separate your control. We spoke about the control. Yeah, how do you as a writer control the reader and take the reader through? So I feel that you then abuse that power of control when you deliberately exclude events that do affect you. I don't know.
Okay. I was having a conversation with Daisy yesterday, and we both agreed that actually everything is political, even love, right? Yes. So when we write about these things, there are a segment of the readers who's going to think, yeah, this is a story about love. But then there's also this segment that's somehow going to find what is political in that story. I like to make an example with Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, an astonishing book. She wrote about really personal things. She wrote about family, love, loss, and all of that. But you see that when people talk about Beloved, they talk about the slavery in it, right? For me, I don't think it was really about that. Like, that wasn't really the part that appealed to me the most. I was more interested in the personal things that she was attacking or she was dealing with in the book. I was at Ake Festival, I think in 2016, and he wrote about the Igbo culture, he wrote about proverbs. But when we talk about things fall apart now, we only talk about the colonial era. We throw all of that gem away. Like, we are just focused on that, on the colonial era, how the white men came, and then everything was no longer as it used to be. So I feel like it all depends on the angles from which we look at it. And when people put a lot more pressure on non-fiction writers, I don't know, but I don't feel like it comes from a genuine place, because seriously, there is such a wealth of literature and stuff about all of these heavy things. So why do you and then when you engage these people and ask them if they've read literature,